The very first book in Nietzsche's life was The Birth of Tragedy, where he discusses the philosophy of music. Everybody is well aware of this concept of Dionysus and Apollo. And this tends to make Nietzsche actually very popular among musicians. People are often not quite aware of this. They imagine he is only read in the academies of universities. But in fact, rock and roll musicians like Jim Morrison and various other people who went on to basically create the concept of modern rock, modern metal, various things like this, they were all big Nietzscheans. Led Zeppelin were as well. And so today, what I've done is I've gotten on a musician who also runs one of the biggest Nietzsche podcasts on the internet to have a chat about Nietzsche, Dionysus, and music. So I think you're going to enjoy this. We're going to ramble on about culture, ramble on about Dionysus, ramble on about Nietzsche, and many other things. So strap up and get ready to have a listen to Mr. Essentialsalts and myself have a chat. What kind of what was the life story of Mr. Essentialsalts?
Yeah, so I did go to college for philosophy, but I'm a college dropout, and I did.
Nice. Jeez, we're very similar, by the way. You know, we've been on similar tracks.
Yeah, well, and the way I always put it is that I could have, I can get the philosophy degree, or I can just start tending bar right now. I don't really need to finish the degree to do that, because philosophy is definitely not going to get you a job unless you want to spend the rest of your life in academia, and I really didn't want to do that. And I was in a band at the time, and I made the kind of decision that you only make when you're like 20 years old. That I'm just going to try and tour with a band, and I did end up doing that. I spent over a dozen years in that band, and I've gotten to see most of the country. I've gotten to tour Europe, and I've gotten to share the stage with a lot of my favorite bands. So it's been an amazing experience. But during that time, that was when I really got back into philosophy, actually, because we would spend a lot of hours out on the road. And especially in the early days when we were touring, the cell phone service wasn't exactly what it is now, the coverage. And a lot of the time, all you could do is just sort of bring a book and read a book for driving 7 or 8 hours across like the desert. And so I had a lot of time to read. And a couple of the bass players that I played with also were very much philosophically inclined. And so we would like swap books and stuff like that. And I would read some things that I would never think to have read. Like Jeff one time, he's like, it was the first time I'd read Dostoevsky, like seriously read Dostoevsky. Obviously we had read like Crime and Punishment in school, but even going back and reading Crime and Punishment again, I always, by the way, this is just sort of like a side note. Whenever people, I saw like Lex Friedman get shamed for his reading list, where he was going over 1984 and Brothers Karamazov, and everyone was sort of making fun of him. It's like, I read these books in high school. When was the last time you read it? Right? Or like, was the last time you read it in an academic setting? Like, try reading it for pleasure and come back to a lot of the classics. That's the great thing about the classics, is you can come back to them, and they're perennially enjoyable, and you'll get something more out of them every time. It's better to.
Sorry to interrupt, but I have to agree. I have to emphasize so much that something that irks me a lot is pretentiousness, because like, as you said, you're a dropout. I'm a dropout as well. And I wouldn't exactly consider either of us stupid. I know that's maybe a little bit boastful to be thinking of ourselves as like massive intellects or something like that. But nothing becomes more of a tell to me that someone's trying to show off that they've got a massive brain when they probably don't, is when they're like, oh, Crime and Punishment is so basic. You're like, lads, come on, what are we doing? Like, come on, give them a break, So sorry, man, go ahead.
Yeah, of course. It's like, I've already heard Mozart once.
Yeah.
No need to listen to it again.
I downloaded it. Yeah, it's good.
Yeah. So in any case, it was the first time I'd read and appreciated a lot of the great books, was the time on tour, actually. And that's the thing, is like, a lot of people would think of touring musicians as, like they have the image in their head of like Motley Crue and like sex, drugs, and rock and roll. A lot of it is like driving and lifting heavy objects, and especially in the genre that we did, because we had to have, like these super heavy speaker cabinets that other bands, I see them like with their speakers on wheels, and they're just rolling it across the street, like smiling. Like, we we had these, we're not the worst by any means. I've seen bands where they have like 8 like full stacks and stuff like that they have to carry on stage every night. But that's just the way of saying, like, it's actually a lot of hard work and rest, and there is like partying involved and having a good time, but it's actually a very I don't know. In a way, I don't want to call it like monk-like because it's really not. You're still like in the world, but in a way, you're kind of just, when you're in a town for a day and a night, you're not connected to anything going on there. You're just kind of in your van in this little, that's the center of your world. And it's a very small area that's like hardly bigger than a prison cell, and you're in it with like four or five guys. So you all have to be able to get along with one another, or you'll find out very quickly that things aren't going to work out for you. So that's what kind of environment it was, and it's actually very. It helps if you want to be in a contemplative, kind of like personal autodidactic study environment. It's actually ideal for that. If assuming you're not in the band with a bunch of people who are party animals, which by the time we were like in our 30s, that wasn't an issue really anymore. So that was sort of my education. Yeah, was getting into Nietzsche and Jung that way. And Nietzsche was always part of. Ever since I was like going to philosophy classes, Nietzsche hooked me immediately, and I always came back to Nietzsche and only grew to love him more and more over the years.
And like I always like that image because people talk about something like the American dream, and you might imagine someone coming there and working their way up and becoming rich after being in poverty. Certainly that is one. But I think in my mind, my consciousness of the American dream is very much tied to the ideas of rock and roll and the idea of like a kid, being a teen saying like fuck you to the world and hopping in a van and just driving across the big long deserts. Like this is what I'd see in Hollywood and this is what I imagine. And he's with his boys and he lives a sort of romantic intellectual life. I think of like Jim Morrison, that's the one that kind of pops into my head is The Doors. And I think Jim was, I'm not sure where he was from, but he goes out to California. He goes out to maybe he lived there. I'm not too sure. But anyway, he's in this journey. And I imagine that him on the bus, and then he's with all these guys and they're all musicians. So obviously they're going to be smart. They're going to talk about stuff. They're going to have philosophical opinions. This is something that people often overlook, but all the rock and rollers were very, very smart guys. What's the guy from the Rolling Stones? Mick Jagger. Like Mick Jagger wrote novels, I believe. He read voraciously. He was really, really well read. And it precisely like people don't understand, but like this is, I guess you could say it's sort of like the modern version of something like a monk or something like maybe the Dionysian character. It's this character who he's free, he's liberated, he's not part of the 9 to 5, he's not stuck in the corporate world, he doesn't have to censor, he doesn't have to morph himself and form a persona to suit that world. Instead, he's this sort of like wandering outsider. And he has this opportunity to get stewed up inside of his intellect. And he's an enormous amount of time as well. And he becomes sort of like an interesting archetype. The way that people look at like ancient Greece and they think of like the philosopher, I think these are interesting ones. The Beat Poets was Jack Kerouac. They were really the ones that like the Doors and all them were into, and they were all Nietzscheans as well. Like Jim Morrison loved Nietzsche and used to read him an awful lot. So you're sort of carrying on the true American tradition as far as I understand.
Yeah, Led Zeppelin as well from across the pond. They were there's the famous quote that after a while they got tired of partying and they just wanted to sit around and read Nietzsche.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So it's interesting. Yeah, definitely. I think. Oh, sorry. Go on.
Well, I was going to ask, like when I read, for example, about Jim Morrison or learn about him, he got into Nietzsche and he was very much like, I'm Dionysus. I'm channeling Dionysus. We're going to make a new Greek theater. We're going to have a new golden age of literature and art and it's Greek theater, and I'll be the Lizard King. And so you could see he was trying to channel that sort of Nietzschean vision of like a new art. Like, why, I think he said, why aren't we walking around all naked in California? That's what it's going to be like.
Right.
Like, were you drawn to Nietzsche for this reason? Did you have like revolutionary instincts inside of you? Do you see metal as like part of that? Do these philosophies relate in any way?
Well, so I think that, okay, to take a step back here, I think one of the things I didn't really understand about Greek tragedy and the Dionysian and all of this that Nietzsche talks about until I really deeply read Birth of Tragedy was the idea that the reason why the Greeks are able to harness the Dionysian is because of how orderly they are as a society, how ordered their mind is. He says they're so clear-sighted, these children of Apollo, the boundary drawing god, and everything in the Greek religion is based on sort of boundaries, sort of each family having their sacred lands and then the lands of the tribe and so on and so forth. And that in another sense, the Dionysian, Nietzsche says sort of, to define it for the audience who might not be familiar, Nietzsche he says that within, there's like a counter, what would we say, like a counterforce to civilization, the animal in man that wants to unbend the bowstring, get rid of the pain of being a man by returning to the bestial. And this is not a uniquely Greek thing. This swept the ancient world. He lists a number of festivals and incidents from ancient world literature in which people sort of lose their minds and the normal social roles are disrupted. And the main thing that they find in this, or the main theme, is ecstasy and a return to more basic instincts, particularly sex, violence, the instincts that are verboten in normal, polite society that we've all been socialized into. I mean, society's role is to suppress those instincts for the sake of that order. And so Nietzsche thinks the genius of the Greeks was that they took that Dionysian force and gave it full expression within the boundaries of the magic circle of tragedy, where you could discharge these feelings. And he says the chorus of singers is sort of like the wall between the audience and the tragedy, which is a representation. It's an image of Dionysus. And what is Dionysus? The breaking of all images. So it's a representation of the end of representation. That's the genius of Greek tragedy, basically. And I remember reading that and being like sort of enchanted with that idea and looking out into society and where do we have that ecstasy, that ecstatic experience in modern society. And it's really not in our religion. Now, I think there might be some counterexamples to that. I mean, I've often brought up the example of Pentecostals. They seem to be having some sort of ecstatic experience, speaking in tongues and handling snakes and all of these things. And I've seen... What's that?
I was just saying they're having a lot of fun. There might be a bit of a delay.
Yeah.
There. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, but some people, the cynical take on what the Pentecostal worship is might be that they're faking it when they speak in tongues. I think some of those people are actually going out of their right mind, as Socrates would have called it. They're being inhabited by a god or a muse. Jung might say that a subcomplex is, or an archetype is speaking through them or something of that nature. Or you could have the actual religious interpretation of it, that it literally is a god or a muse. But by and large, in the Western world, in modern secular society, we don't really have too much ecstasis going on in our rituals. We don't really have much in the way of mystical experience at all. A lot of what constitutes religion in modern times, I would describe as sort of like the hardened and rigidified, what would you say, like just sort of like the shell of what was once sort of like a magma flow. Like there was once the religious experience is like sort of the vital energy of the religion. It's what keeps it going. And by that, I mean like people having visions. I mean, the sheer amount of visions when you look in ancient world literature. And I'd be interested in your thoughts on why this is. I guess people do still have visions today and they still report them. It's just a lot of people reflexively will dismiss that or have another explanation. But I mean, even the number of historical events that were determined by a vision. I mean, Constantine, does he convert the Roman Empire to Christianity if he doesn't have a vision to mark all of his shields of his troops with the Cairo, or I forget the pronunciation, the sign at the time of Christianity? It seems that is sort of the life's blood of the religion that keeps it alive. And so in any case, that's what I think a lot of people are looking for, and it doesn't exist in religion anymore, but I did see it in music. And I did notice also, and this is kind of like a weird thing, that there is almost like a cultish element to a lot of music and musical genres. That thriving off of that living energy of like people having what in the past they might have called a religious experience where they kind of go out of their mind. And this is particularly true in heavy metal. I don't know how true it is in other genres. A lot of those bands then sort of almost promote sometimes a cause, sometimes an ideology, but sometimes a genuine religious belief. I mean, there's the example of those satanic bands. And if anyone knows who Varg Vikernes is, he is in jail because he killed somebody, but during a time when a lot of people got killed as part of, when they were kind of just freaking out over nothing, over a satanic panic over here in the US. Over there were people literally burning down churches and murdering people as human sacrifices and killing themselves for, but that all sounds crazy, right? Until you think about the fact that the Scandinavian societies are the most sort of safe, secure, privileged, comfortable places on earth. And you grow up in that completely conflict, struggle-less environment. And what do you want to do? You're like the man that's described in Notes from Underground, who wants to say, even by cannibalism, I'm a man and not a piano key, right? I'm going to burn down this church, this historical, this great object of historical relevance to our country. I'm going to like end another human being's life just to destroy this monotony of this like safe and polite society. That would be my theory behind why there was a string of incidents in Sweden and Norway at the time. But the broader sort of point is the way that vector that traveled on was like religious in nature, like they were Satanists, right? The music had the power to foster, what is in should be kind of an absurd belief, right? I mean, it's all a little bit silly. It strikes me as LARPing in a lot of ways, but music was the vector that was able to affect that. So anyway, I was always very attracted to that about music, even though I don't endorse any of those particular applications of it, if that makes sense. I saw the power in music, and I had that experience with music, and so that's what drew me to it.
Well, I think that's a wonderful angle to get into like a huge array of different topics, because fundamentally, when you think of the Dionysian, as you describe in Birth of Tragedy, that is exactly something that Nietzsche says. And in some sense, people maybe get a little bit bewitched about the ancient Greeks. You know, they say, oh, the Apollo, Dionysus, and all this, and it's like, well, you can maybe, it's almost like a Jordan Peterson idea. You know, you have order and chaos, and that's sort of perennial. It's everywhere. You know, so in our society, in your society, in America, there is obviously like highly ordered society going on all the time to make sure that everybody shows up to work all the time. Just as I was saying there a minute ago, the musician sort of floats outside of that. You know, the musician is the dissolver. In a weird way, the musician is the priest, because obviously God is dead, religion has died, but the instincts never go away. And it's a sort of something what Nietzsche was maybe saying is the rise of the god Dionysus. Maybe he kind of preordained this, although we didn't quite understand perhaps what he was preordaining. But with the death of God and the death of the priests, it's not like the instincts for escaping order were going to go away. It's not like the instincts for us wanting to dissolve ourselves into like mobs were going to go away. And in fact, they got stronger. And Nietzsche again also alluded to this. The religious instincts were getting stronger. This desire to get into states of ecstasy actually got stronger. And again, I come back to like Jim Morrison and the Doors, because I think they're such a brilliant example of this, because they happened during the 1960s and they sort of created modern consciousness a little bit. And what was wrapped up with what they were doing? Well, they saw themselves as like reevaluators of all morals. That was the first thing. Like all of them were saying to themselves, hey, this prudish Protestant Christian upbringing we had in the 50s, we're going to go around and we're going to destroy this, and we're going to create something new. And I remember like Jim Morrison again, and he's a crazy bastard. His dad was like a general in the army, really high quality general as well. And then Jim Morrison was on stage back home singing like "fuck your girlfriend in the ass" and stuff like this. And it's like, what the Jim? What is going on? His dad was like, well, Jim, what are you wasting your life up to? Like, you could be a general of the U.S. Army, most powerful military that has ever graced the world, and you're running around, you know, being a madman. Ecstasy, you speak about that, like obviously psychedelics, an enormous part of this. In fact, even studying music from this period, you see the dissolution of the I love you basic bitch rock forms, you know, and then the Beatles come along, and then Black Sabbath and Led Zeppelin, and there's this sort of like, you know, it goes from the blues like into like, and it just starts to get more psychedelic and crazy. Jim Morrison and the Doors starts to develop out these like big sort of trance like songs and all this. It becomes more primitive. The drums get thicker and heavier and all this. And it is like the birth of this almost like new culture that happens in that moment that I believe we're still living in at the moment. And you see with all that was happening at that point, so many Nietzschean themes. You know, as I'm saying, there's this figure like Jim Morrison who's the Dionysian god. And he's a satyr as well. And he's performing the Birth of Tragedy Dionysian music. He's performing drama. And he's sucking all the youth into this new religious experience. There's actually videos of him you can find on the internet of him speaking to priests. A priest comes to meet him and he wants to talk to him and say, like, like the priest is like, you're doing something religious. And Jim's like, yeah, I guess I am, bro. Yeah, dude. Yeah, kind of fucking religious, man. And then he obviously dies. He becomes the sacrifice at 27 as well. and it's this absorbing of all this. And I guess it's that like instinct, that desire to break free was necessary, and he kind of served this function, this role that did it. And a lot of things come out of this. And again, like in terms of psychology, there's just so many fascinating things about this. But go on, if there's anything you'd like to say.
Well, just yeah, a quick interjection, in case anyone wanted like an example, because you kind of mentioned. Well, it's funny because the way kind of implicitly playing off a lot of the premises we've established, right? The way that you just kind of casually said it, like, well, this religion offering like a break from, you know, the sort of monotony of society. And to a lot of modern people, they would probably think like, what are you talking about? Like, religion is boring and monotonous. It's part of my like work week. But if you look at the history, if you want an example of like religion serving that function, Carl Jung talks about this. There was something called the Ass Festival, or the Festo, I forget the first, like in Latin, something Asinorum, where basically they would like ride a donkey all the way into the Catholic Church and then have mass with the donkey in the church. The priest would like bray 3 times at the end of the ceremony, and then they would play like a ball game inside the cathedral or inside the church. And, you know, it involved like all sorts of, you know, they would elect a fool's pope. And there's like letters where there's bishops complaining that there are even like respectable priests and bishops participating in this, like kind of getting in on the fun. Like, okay, they're really, this has gone too far. Like, we have bishops as part of actual people, cardinals who might elect the actual pope, voting on who the fool's pope will be at this, you know, annual festival where we kind of flip everything on its head. And I believe Carl Jung says that he kind of ties it to Saturnalia and these sorts of festivals, and believes it has sort of like a pagan origin before the Christian, but that it kind of got incorporated into Christianity. But you can find hundreds of years apart. There were always kind of like the old stuffy moralists of the church having a problem with it, but it provided, like many holidays were in when Europe was incredibly religious and incredibly like saw the world as a spiritual battleground, interpreted everything religiously. During those times, religion often provided the break to the monotony. And pretty much all the holidays that the serfs had were there as a sort of, what would you say? That was like a sop to the working people. On these religious holidays, those are the days when you don't have to go out and till your fields and work. So, yeah, I think that aspect of religion, of actually breaking up the monotony and being the gateway to mystical experiences or to things that are a sort of flip of the norm, is a really valuable role of religion, and it seems to be largely lost today in formal, institutionalized religion.
So there's such an enormous point here. There's actually 2 really fascinating points here that I'd love to get into. So the first of all is the actual literal life vital force that comes out of that sort of breaking free. Because if you think about a peasant's life 700 years ago, they had way more sex, they had way more free time, and they were probably way happier than we are now, even though we have all the liberties we could ever want. We're far more educated than them and all these type of things. And why would this be? Well, like one of them is that the church obviously protected them from capitalism. So the church basically said, sorry lads, we have 150 days of religious holidays, and there's just no way you're going to get work out of these motherfuckers otherwise. And then because of all this work, because of all this free time, you know, the church is obviously being like, you must breed for God. So go use your free time, have a lot of fun, have hanky-panky. There was no travel, there was no globalization, there was no internet, there was no education. The church were like, you don't even need to read any of this crap. It's Plato, you know? It's like, we'll be the philosopher kings here, champs. You just go and be the flock. But fundamentally, the flock might have been more happy, more hanky-panky, all this type of stuff. Now, you contrast this with our time, which this is very interesting. Our time, which has the blessings of liberty. Our time, which has, as I said, education. We're the most enlightened people in all world history, you know? What are we going through right now? A crushing birth rate collapse. We're going through sterility. North Korea basically has like no children left. All of Europe, and there's no replacement fertility in any of the developed countries. There's this enormous kind of cataclysm of all this. Now, this is very, very strange. Why is this happening? Is this a consequence of religion dying out? Is this a consequence of religion forgetting its role? Religion has actually tried to become a little bit stuffy, and it's actually forgot that it's supposed to be a little bit crazy. It's supposed to be a bit Pentecostal. It's like religion, if the closer religion gets gets to a rock concert, the more power it could harvest. Like that's a fascinating critique to say to like a right-wing Catholic. You know, it's like if you actually stole the thunder off heavy metal music and made mosh pits, would you actually lead to a rise in the fertility rate or something like this? There's stuff in there. Is there anything you want to say?
Well, yeah, really quick. And it's funny how you see there's like Protestant megachurches in the US who do try to almost replicate the energy of a rock concert in some ways with like the arena seating and like a jumbotron and a big band. But it's funny because it completely lacks the Dionysian in every way. Like and I can't even really put into words why specifically, but you just know if you go into like a big, megachurch, people aren't actually like losing themselves in ecstasy. It's like a big I don't know. There's something very artificial about it, right?
I think this is actually Jung and Nietzsche kind of combined together. But like, to be Dionysian, you have to be evil. Like, you have to be willing to be like, I'm an animal, I'm a monster, I'm a demon. Like Jung would talk about this in quite at length in Ion, that like evil doesn't have a presence in Western culture and the church, and that's a really bad thing because it gives it actually more power when evil is outside your consciousness, is kind of how he would describe it, very Jungian. And you go into a church and it's very rosy and it's very sort of fresh and middle class, and they're trying to like, it's actually kind of like LinkedIn religiosity, And then you go and you go into a metal concert, and Jim Morrison's there like, take psychedelics, break your mind, the world is the demiurge, and it's like, have sex with everyone. It's like, it's just, I'm the lizard king. That's a whole different, it's a scary energy, and it's obviously a bit dangerous as well, which leads kind of into the second thing I wanted to say, is that I'm noticing, I'm sure you've noticed as well, there's an enormous right-wing backlash rising, like a cultural presence now that's building up and gaining sort of predominance at this point, that is ferociously hardcore on the order side of things, and it's coming back very hard with like, we want Catholicism to come back to literally ban liberalism, ban freedom of rights, ban Dionysus altogether. We want to crush all this stuff. And it's actually understandable, because you see how this dissipation process that's happened since the 1960s has basically led to like a very weird set of forces where we're very frigid and we're very like, we've still got the Apollonian, but it's like corporate LinkedIn Apollonian, and it leads to all the sterility, which is the bad side of that. And then the Dionysian is like really struggling because it's too loose, and for some reason it can't produce anything as well. So because obviously what Nietzsche said is that the two gods must work together at a healthy part in culture, Right. And we've kind of got that type of thing going on. So maybe you have some thoughts on that, or just any general thoughts on what I'm saying here.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because Nietzsche says that when you have the absence of one element, you don't get like a pure Dionysian or a pure Apollonian. What you actually get is, he describes it as Alexandrian, which he calls like a purely theoretical age, and that would sort of be like the overdose of order. But it's not like Apollo, because Apollo is like a dream god. So Apollo is aware that representation is a representation, if that makes sense. That there is some sort of artistic element to how we represent the world to ourselves that is sort of inherent to Apollo. And the theoretical, like the purely ordered mind, can't deal with that, right? There's no artistic, irrational element at all. Like, we're going to get down to the real reality, the intelligible world. And then what Nietzsche calls like a purely, like when you take away the Apollonian entirely, he actually calls it Buddhistic. And I think in an earlier draft, he called it Brahmanic. But it's really just like pure dissolution of sort of not caring about anything in a way, or sort of losing. I would compare it really to his idea of the last man. And I think that's why he invokes the idea of Buddhism, because when Nietzsche talks about Buddhism, he says that the Buddha basically showed up to teach people how to die passively, or how to really go through life passively as well.
The Buddha was an overdose in order, or and embracing the Dionysian fully?
It would be like, I wouldn't call it embracing the Dionysian. I would call it a complete lack of order, a complete lack of Apollo. Okay. And he doesn't really give an example of that type of society. It's only in one line in Birth of Tragedy where he says every society could be classed as Alexandrian, Hellenic, or Buddhistic. And it's really weird too, because the Dionysian's associated with wine. So it's like, why would that be correlated with Buddhism where they don't drink? But it's interesting, if you look into the way that the Buddhists talk about jhana, that's the term that would eventually become transliterated into the term Zen in like Zen meditation. even going back to Theravada Buddhism and the Pali Canon, they're talking about the jhanas that you can reach, and these are states of ecstasy. Um, and it's actually very interesting. The Buddha argues that one of the reasons why monks, if you're ever like getting tempted by worldly pleasures, there's a number of things you can repeat to yourself. You can sort of bring to mind how impermanent and hollow all these earthly pleasures are. But one of the things he says is that you can bring to mind how I have the pleasure of jhana. I have the ecstasy of this meditative experience. That's the dissolution of the ego, essentially. It's described as ecstatic. And that you can hold up that pleasure to yourself as a way of sort of saying, I don't need these other worldly pleasures, which is very interesting from a Nietzschean will to power model, that you're sort of, there isn't actually an absence of desire at any point, like the Buddhists promise, right? You're teaching yourself to desire for this ecstatic experience you can create through meditation. So a sort of masturbatory experience of ecstasy that doesn't involve any worldly ambition or striving or anything like that. But which you can do without engaging in any of sort of your basic instincts. So anyway, yeah, that's how I would sort of describe it. And so, yeah, the way I would look at our situation today, actually, which is very interesting, we saw with the Olympics that I think we're having a return to like the moral majority politics of like people being angry about heavy metal and like depictions of Satan and Dionysus in media. Like going back to the 1980s and 90s. And it'll be very interesting to hear what the right-wing commentary has to say about that, given that they've cast themselves as the free speech people, free expression people, and basically often invoked the example that it used to be that the right wing were the moral majority wagging their finger at you people, and now it's the left. Well, so that's part of my reaction to this right wing backlash you kind of see. But I think it's a bit misdirected because I don't actually see our society as going in that purely dissolutionist, like ego death. Like I don't think Jim Morrison, I think you're onto something that there's like, that's part of in its genuine form, part of a counterculture that has always sort of existed within American society. But I think a lot of the responsibility for the birth rate dropping, for example, actually comes from that theoretical way of life, from the excess of order, because I think it's coming from a technocratic agenda, which, by the way, actually makes a lot of sense if you think about it. Like, if you think from a strictly materialistic worldview, put yourself in that perspective, this planet is probably the only one we have. And then you think, okay, now we've gotten to the point where basically we don't need additional human beings, and the sheer volume of human beings is the thing that's taxing the planet. We should let the population have a managed decline. If I was technocratically managing a society that I was the elite person over, that's exactly what I would think. So, and so put yourself in their shoes.
Keegan's giving us a bit of soft disclosure here. He knows something, does he? He got the memo on his travels around Texas. Yeah.
Well, I'm basing it, like we all know like the Georgia Guidestones and like stuff that was like the center of a lot of conspiracies, but or like the 15-minute cities and like WEF, like you're going to live in the pot and eat the bugs. There's all these sort of memes that go around that drive a lot of the right wing outrage, right? But they should recognize that that's not coming from like a counterculture, or it's not coming from to the extent that like music and popular media has been used to promote that agenda. That's not like an authentic expression of like the Dionysian. That is more of a machination of a theoretical approach to the technocratic approach to managing society. The idea that you can have this managed decline, and it's a new experiment. It remains to be seen how it works out. I, for one, I'm all for it.
I've actually loads of things I'd love to go into there, because these are great topics. Like I'd love to talk about, for example, someone called Kalergi, who's very controversial, but I actually think he's brilliant, because he's someone that everybody has an opinion on, nobody has read, and you actually read him, and he's like brutally rational. Like he's very interesting, and he gets accused of all sorts of things. So maybe we can go into him for a second. But before we go into him, I would so something I'd love to ask you, because that's a really good point. I'm too young to remember the 90s. And you're sort of saying that there was a very dominant sort of Christian moral outrage thing, because you're bringing up Varg earlier, and again, like I know Varg, and I don't know his backstory that well, and I wasn't aware that there was like a satanic panic going on in the 90s, because I've heard that phrase before, and I just for some reason thought it was like the 50s or something like this, but there was something like that going on. So there was like what we saw perhaps with the Olympics and everyone being like, they're Satanists, they're mocking Jesus, which I believe they were, you know, but nonetheless people were outraged about it. What is
the idea, the backtracking where they're like, no, it was this other painting, it wasn't the Last Supper. I mean, come on. We know what it was. Just own it. Like, I don't. And that's the thing, like, a lot of the things that happen in like in pop music that people like have conspiracies about, you can pick up a black metal album where there's no question that they're openly mocking Jesus and you know like, Christianity. That's like part of their whole thing. But what I was going to say, in the 80s and 90s in the US, there was a thing called, like, it was like surrounded around, it actually ties into psychology, satanic ritual abuse. So there were a number of cases where they would do regression therapy and have kids, mostly kids, like remember instances of abuse through hypnosis and be like, you suppress this memory, right? But we think you were abused. They would suspect the kid was abused. They'd hypnotize them, do a regression therapy. And then they would say, yeah, my daycare teacher put me as part of like a satanic like ritual or something like that, right? Now, of all these people who like went to jail during this period of time, late 80s, early 90s, the vast majority were overturned on appeal. They would basically find out that a lot of the time, like the kid's story didn't make any sense. The details didn't line up. Like they would basically, what had happened a lot of the time is you had a detective and a psychiatrist in the room asking a series of leading questions to an impressionable kid, and getting them to invent memories, which is another thing that we can do, especially when you think like that's the thing you should say and you'll be rewarded by an adult for saying it. So vast majority of those cases got overturned. I'm not exactly sure. I'm trying to think of like a good resource to look into it, but I'm sure if you look on YouTube, like there's probably some documentary about it.
Freud got in a lot of trouble for that too. Like, because Freud's obviously famous for child psychology and pathologizing children, and like people look back at it, and I don't think we can know, but people are like, was Freud speaking to abused kids and telling them that like, oh yeah, you've got a mother you've got an anal complex and all this, and it's like, wait a second now, your sexualized thoughts as a child, and it's like, wait, are you sure that kid was okay? And it's very difficult to know because of misremembering and because of like implanting thoughts and stuff like this, and because of just the nature of fantasy. It's a very difficult problem. It's a scary problem, definitely a scary problem, because there is real abuse out there as well. So that's fascinating. I didn't know it was that dark. So all these people were these cases were coming up, and then this started
mostly
to spread.
against like daycare workers and like teachers, and then like I'm sure there were some parents and stuff like that. The X-Files like did an episode kind of like riffing on that whole idea at the time. And then also, in addition to this, like while this is going on, that's when you had Al Gore's wife, Tipper Gore, was doing those hearings with the Parent Music Resource Center, basically getting ratings and labels on all of the music. And they had the Filthy 15, where they dragged like 15 albums, or they put like 15 albums on like a chart in front of Congress and said like, these are the most disgusting like records out there. And so there was sort of like a general like family values push against like panic against Satanism and heavy metal music going on at the same time in sort of like the late 80s.
Man, so that's like, that sounds like the right-wing golden age back then, when they were cracking down on the... Do you know what's fascinating about this? Because again, we talk about memory and forgetfulness, this may be a topic we'll properly get into now in a moment, but there's this notable thing about just people in general, is that like the capacity to have a historical memory is just very difficult. It's very tough. It's very hard for me to imagine the 90s, a period where like there was like gangs of Christian censors wandering around trying to shut people down. Like I can't imagine that. It feels so much like the opposite at the moment. But yet that was happening. And I even think in my youth, like the first real music artist that I knew was Eminem. And he was literally attacking the exact thing you're describing there, and it never made sense to me because I didn't understand. I was too young to understand like prudish parents controlling censorship. But Eminem, if you listen to Eminem's music, it's all like, they're like, I want to say fuck, I want to say faggot, I want to say all this, I want to curse, I want to say this, and they won't let me, and the FCC won't let me be, let me be me, just let me, because it's all complaining about censorship, and he was actually taboo, and he was trying to erode at that sort of middle America consciousness. He has a song called White America that particularly attacks that thing, and I wonder, was it a legacy from that that came up in the late 80s and the 90s?
Yeah, well, and what's also interesting about just the '90s in general is that, yeah. So, like you mentioned, Eminem, like you had this, like that's like when rap and hip hop are starting to become like really popular, especially like kind of making it into the mainstream. Like rap and hip hop has existed arguably since the '70s. People debate about that, but definitely since the '80s, '90s, it comes into the mainstream. And then in addition to that, you have you know, like Columbine happens, and Marilyn Manson is like one of the people blamed for it as well.
Yeah.
And there's this like gang association with rap and hip hop. So it felt like it's just like a perfect storm of like so many genres of music, basically an artistic expression being blamed for cultural and social problems and economic problems. And the thing is, I'm not going to say that that's all wrong. There's this real problem that I see on the left of like failure to acknowledge the cultural as a real force. They don't want to acknowledge that culture can affect anything. And
Sorry, you said the
whereas
left.
on the right, yeah,
Wow.
yeah, well,
Okay.
that I mean, I guess I'm thinking of the economic left, right? Because they think that basically material conditions are going to cause everything. Let me give you an example. Like, what's the cause of inner city poverty? Is it because they have lack of adequate resources and there's not enough sort of social spending in that area, and they don't have infrastructure and all of these material things that could improve their lives? Or if you that would be like the left wing critique, right? And then all of these cultural problems follow. Somebody like Thomas Sowell would then say, no, it's because you have an urban culture that is opposed to any number of things like respect and hard work and discipline and so on, right? And that politics is downstream of the culture. I think obviously it's both. Like we live in a material world, but also there is and like you can't ignore the brute power realities, right? One of the things I've noticed with, especially with a recent geopolitical conflict that will remain unnamed, is that because of the fact that the left always frames things in terms of power struggle, the right does the same thing and will kind of ignore when there's an obvious power imbalance in the mix and basically be like, oh, what are we woke now because you're taking the side, everything's oppression? It's like, no, not everything is, but some things are oppression.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think that's all just to say, like, the cultural does have a real effect on society. And so the right wingers were not wrong to look at things like Marilyn Manson and gangster rap and heavy metal and say, hold on, what are we doing with society? I mean, you could argue this was a lot of the point of Alan Bloom's book, a very popular conservative text in like 1987, where he basically said, he goes back to Socrates at the beginning of the book and says, every society on earth has been concerned about what kind of art is made within the society. Like you simultaneously say art is so powerful it can change the world, it has so much power, but then when we say, okay, well then if it's powerful then it's dangerous, we should take it seriously, you say, whoa, it's just art, what are you worried
Yeah,
about?
don't censor
And
it.
those two ideas don't go together.
Yeah.
That like, and so I am somebody who recognizes the power of art, and I actually think having Jim Morrison, I think that's a net positive for society. But I think maybe some of the what would we say, what the right would call degeneracy, or the counterculture of the left getting out of control, is from their their unwillingness to actually take culture seriously. And a lot of people would say, well, they have a cultural agenda. Clearly it's like, well, I think a lot of the cultural agenda is basically just thumbing our nose at any sort of cultural value or the importance of culture, making a mockery of it. And again, that's just something that they should take more seriously and raise more questions about. Just as on the right hand side, they should be a little bit more serious about like material conditions and actual power dynamics. Like just because somebody's talking about power dynamics doesn't mean there's not an actual power dynamic. So yeah, that's just a side point, I guess, to what we're talking about. But yeah.
Oh man, you brought up so many brilliant points there. There's loads I want to go into. I guess the main thing, I'm kind of harkening back to what I said there a minute ago, but it's like you seem to have actually quite a good memory, obviously because you're into metal. You kind of like have lived, you've historically built that experience of going through like the kind of history of the music, and you probably have a particularly good memory for the ebb and flow of culture. And obviously me, maybe just a bit of a shallower memory, maybe I don't remember things as clearly. And an awful lot of people, obviously like the Zoomers that are growing up now, they would have kind of grown up. Like I'm meeting people now who literally would have hit like 12 years old when Donald Trump was running, or 10 years old when Donald Trump was running. And
Right.
that's really strange because their experience of a Dionysian Jim Morrison destroyer, a figure of breaking taboos, their experience of that character is Donald J. fucking Trump. Like that's what they experience. Now, for me, for example,
Yeah.
it was Eminem. And again, I was really young when Eminem was like Eminem had retired by the time I started listening to him, or he had like overdosed on drugs or whatever it was. And I remember listening to all his music like about 2, 3, 4 years too late, and I was like, wow, this is so good. This is so crazy. And again, it was that dissolving force. I could understand that he was like wagging his finger up at the sensibilities of middle America, of this type of thing, of conservative culture. And he was giving out about George Bush and stuff like this, you know? And I went on and I lived my life. And then a couple of years later, well, like, over a decade later, Donald Trump shows up, and I'm in my early 20s. And Trump shows up, and all of a sudden I could see immediately that there's something very significant about this man. Like, because it was just the way he psychologically affected people. Like, I had no interest in American politics.
Same year as Brexit too.
So Brexit, for example.
Same year as Brexit.
Yeah, so I remember Brexit happening, and like again, Brexit was strange because like being Irish, you know, like it's like the English are doing something crazy, all right, whatever. But everybody in Ireland had an opinion, but I'm just like whatever, you know. There's like another reason for people to be mad at the English. No surprise, people are talking crap about this. But I remember, yeah, there was a lot of these strange things going on, and there was all this like force building up, and there was this taboo breaking down. So I'm wondering how you see it, where do these like figures like Donald Trump, comedians, Eminem, even Kanye West, Jim Morrison, Axl Rose, Kurt Cobain, they act as sort of like Dionysian dissolvers. And then you have the order, the Apollonian order, which sits in the middle, and it just sort of like slogs away and just, it's like the Platonic herd, you know, the flock. It runs society. It has its sort of sensibilities. It's always sort of a castration of your true soul. It always has to cut off your instincts. It always has to hold you together in this type of blob. That's sort of like one process that I'm seeing. I guess that's one question I have. And then the second kind of follow-up question is there a weird evolution happening? Because I notice now, obviously with like the woke and the massive censorship that took place in like 2017 after Trump and all this, was actually a weird experience for a lot of people, because it seemed like, quote unquote, the left had the machines of censorship where it was able to enforce taboos against what we might call the right wing, which is weird because the right wing used to be the people who were always doing that. And now they had kind of lost that. And it seemed like a new set of values was kind of asserting this. So do you follow what I'm saying? Do you think there's any credence to what I'm saying? Do you disagree in any way?
No, I think what we saw from a series of leaks, I mean, mostly having to do with the Twitter files, but a number of other places, there does seem to be like a sort of, I mean, we could even look back to 2016, the same year as Donald Trump, when the DNC openly collaborated with major news networks like NBC News, where they were like sharing their questions ahead of time with the Clinton campaign, implicitly agreeing to cover the Bernie Sanders campaign in a different way. I think there did come to be a sort of culturally hegemonic power to the Democratic Party that allowed Trump to position himself as this countercultural figure. But I want to back up to the sort of like the first thing you asked, which sort of like, is he this sort of, you know, how would I see his role in, you know, being like a Dionysian force or something like that? So the first thing I would say is like an artist or a politician, they both are doing something that is creative and, you know, I guess what I would say, the politician is a kind of artist. They're a kind of actor in a way. They have to fulfill a certain role. Anyone who has a public facing life has to, in some sense, be an actor. And they have to be on stage all the time, more or less. And there is an art to that. There is a craft to it. And there are great artists in the political sense. And Nietzsche talks about these people all the time. And so some of the people, the greatest artists, the greatest politicians, you know, the artists of statecraft, the greatest philosophers, Nietzsche says, the kind of artist that gives us a picture of universal existence in the form of abstract concepts, which I think is a wonderful definition for the philosopher. These people can kind of become like legislators of values. And what I would say is that the vast, vast majority of all of those types of occupations, so the majority of musicians and singers, even very charismatic singers, and songwriters they're not going to have that power to legislate values, right? It'll be like a really small handful of them, and then of those, there will only be so many that like the circumstances line up just right for them to start like a sort of cultural movement. So one example from ye olden times is Richard Wagner, Nietzsche's friend. He creates a successful cultural movement around his music. Basically, the music is the center of it, but they have an annual festival. They have a newsletter. They have followers all over Europe, and it creates this sort of zeitgeist, right? So there are some people now we have, I don't really know what he stands for, but Jared Leto, he started a little cult.
Oh yeah.
He's a musician and an actor, and yeah, he's got his little cult. So maybe he'll start a social movement. We don't really know. So they would be few and far between, right? And we kind of don't really know who is the legislator of values until we retrospectively analyze it, right? Because that requires you to sort of have knowledge of the future. But that ties into maybe a bigger point that I would really approach an analysis of somebody like Trump more along the lines of my influence from Peter Turchin and his work on what he calls secular cycles. He wrote a book called Ages of Discord, which is a analysis according to his historical theory, like a mathematized history where he tries to do history as a science and determine what it is that makes societies integrate, come together, and then disintegrate. He says emperiogenesis, the foundation of empires, and imperiopathosis, the decline and fall of empires. And he applies that analysis to United States political history. And what we find, for example, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, it's another one of those things that you talk about, like kind of cultural memory that is largely forgotten. A lot of people know about the Gilded Age, that it was a time of extreme sort of the pyramid inverting and there being way too much elite production and competition and opulent spending. That's where they do the Chicago World's Fair, and they're building like replicas of like these European monuments that are just temporary. Like replicas of the Eiffel Tower and stuff like that, like in downtown Chicago. And they're building these big high rises and building railroads across the country, doing these crazy expenditures. But at the same time, political violence was at an all-time high. And Turchin documents how just the number of assassinations and assassination attempts go way up. And oftentimes it tied directly into the elite overproduction. So, a judge gets assassinated in Texas, and then who's the assassin? He's a guy who's been passed up for federal judgeships a bunch of times and finally goes and just pops one of the judges. In addition to this, especially once we get to the turn of the century, riots, crazy numbers of riots where multiple people are killed. A lot of the, like we have Labor Day as a holiday for the workers. Again, you don't talk about giving a sop to your workers. We got that holiday as a result of riots that were happening where the workers were constantly upset. And agitated. And many believed in the 19 teens and 20s that the United States was actually in a pre-revolutionary state from this level of dissolution and chaos that was going on. That's why that's where neoconservatism comes from. A lot of them were Trotskyists and neo-Trotskyists who basically were looking around, seeing the way the wind is blowing and saying, wow, America's probably going to have a socialist revolution. We should get on board now with like the mildest form of socialism and try and like guide the revolution in that direction. And then a lot of them eventually sort of like rebuked Trotskyism and became neoconservatives. But if you look at like Leo Strauss and James Burnham and a lot of these people, that's the path they started down. And it started from this sense of the inevitability of a socialist revolution in America. And that was just simply because, and they called it the violent teens. That was the name at the time for the 19-teens, the 1910s, basically, is that this was one of the most violent times in America. Labor wars, shootings, assassinations, riots all over the place. What would be my point in this? Well, coming out of the heels of that is FDR, who completely transforms the American society. The American state as it is now is a completely different thing post-FDR than it was pre-FDR. And the reason for that, the opportunity for that, was because he comes along at the end of a disintegrative period where you're in this chaos, you're in this interregnum, and so there's the opportunity for a vast sweeping transformation of everything that already exists. And so if we look at the data of what Turchin's model predicts, we're basically headed into that for the next 30 years. And so the attempted assassination of Trump, for example, is one such event. And that we should actually expect to see more such events become more and more frequent as the disintegrative cycle becomes more intense. And so it makes it very unlikely to me that Trump will actually be the transformative figure in the long run. But I think he will be one of the historically significant figures at the beginning of this period, and that we'll see some sort of significant change or transformation at the end of this, as or either that or the American empire just dies off. It's entirely possible. But if we reconstitute ourselves, usually what happens is, the other major inflection point was the Civil War. There's usually a complete sort of reinterpretation of what the nation is. Usually this actually happens, like if you look at the French, they're on like their fifth or sixth constitution, right? We've kept with the same one, we just amended a bunch of times. But usually you kind of like reconstitute yourself, like establish your reign on a different basis. So I would expect to see that, and I don't think we're quite there yet. I think we should expect another 30 years approximately of chaos. But that's I don't want to defend that claim because it'd have to go into like a lot of Tertian's research, but it has to do with anyone who's interested in that should look into Ages of Discord. Like,
I think anybody at this point who isn't sort of turning around to a lot of these things and saying, all right, these guys predicted stuff that was not, they are hitting on stuff. What If Alt Hist is another example of a figure on YouTube who talks about these things.
I just saw your talk with him, and I would just want to say I love his channel. I was so glad to see you two talk.
Good. I'll put the two of you in touch because I think he'd actually love an awful lot of the angle you come out a lot of this stuff from. And he's a smart young kid. He's great.
That'd be great.
And like everything you're saying here, like he's huge into this stuff. And we've been talking because I remember, like, I'm maybe coming from the world a little bit more literate and coming from like history's perspective. He obviously comes from history too. But I was reading about like Caesar, and I put the video up, and I was like, Julius Caesar is, are we in the times of Julius Caesar? And it's so similar to, well, actually, Turchin was part of the background research for that, and you're one of the people who put me on to Turchin. I remember checking out your video on it and being like, I had heard of Turchin before, but you actually like fully flesh it out. And I was like, oh God, I should definitely give this guy some time. And seeing that concept, and you see all the same phenomenon happen in ancient Rome, in the Republic. You have the elite optimates, so the established elite, and then you have this rise of this left-wing elite, essentially, although that's not the right word, but it's the popularis, the people for the people. But really it's like an elite class of Caesars, or the Julius clan, who are Marius, Julius Caesar, and they're like, and a billionaire is called Gracchi, and that's what Donald Trump is sort of like. And they're like an alternate elite, sort of saying, guys, we need to reform, we need to reconstitute society. And you're absolutely right, like the amount of murder that comes as a consequence of that is enormous. The Gracchis were like Trump-like billionaires who stood up and said, guys, we should do the political process here and do some, like, we should help out the poor, we should help out the working man a little bit. And the optimates were like, should we? Well, it would have been like, shing, all right, should we? Goodbye, Gracchi. And then obviously Caesar comes along, and even like there's like mass murders, proscriptions. They make a list, kill all their political opponents. Caesar comes in and basically just the amount of blood that gets spilt in order to create the empire, to have a reconstitution. And my God, is it some reconstitution, like a complete flip of how the world works. And so like all of that is to say, this certainly seems like we're coming into this type of time. Like the bullet, even going towards Trump, is an indicator that we were like about to experience, we're about to experience, God knows what would have happened after that, because tensions are obviously high right now, And I'm wondering, like, there's a lot of things I'm wondering about, because on the one hand, we're talking about Dionysus and music and all this. There has been this kind of period since the 50s, after World War II. It's like Pax Americana, the Americans have basically ran the world. The hegemons have been there. And during that period, there was this sort of rise of, I guess you could say, music. And this is something Nietzsche spoke about, is that like for a long time, a warrior culture fights, and then it gets predominance. Like Alexander the Great fights, conquers and creates Hellenism. And then within this safe space of Hellenism, all of a sudden the cultural people are freed. And all the sons of the warriors are free to go up and start to play music and make theater. And that's actually where an awful lot of innovation comes from. Athens, in the rise to the moment of Athens, you have a warrior culture of the ancient Athenians. They create the republican state. It evolves sort of into a democratic state. And then it becomes like this kind of Renaissance state for a brief period. And then it burns itself out and it declines. And then Alexander the Great comes in and takes it over. And so there's sort of like like Nietzsche always uses the metaphor of like a feminine blossoming, saying that like cultures shoot up and then they create stability, blossom, and then wilt and die. And so I'm wondering, like, perhaps is that what America might be going through? That for the last 70 years, that was the blossom. That was the moment where sort of Anglo-America, world dominance, they had won the biggest war in all of human history, and they flowered. They blossomed. 1960s was just the opening up of the blossoms. Everybody came out for a party. All these Dionysian figures showed up. We got back into ecstasy. There's this huge pollination of the world. Literally, like, the metaphor continues this way. The pollen shoots out into the air. Everybody now listens to American culture. And then is it beginning to wilt? And are we now beginning to fall back into sort of a political age? And are there new rivals, right? Like, is China going to take over or something? Like, what is going to go on after this? So there's a lot of interesting kind of avenues to go down here. What do you think?
I think the way you just described it is what I would agree with as basically the picture of what's happened. And that's why I'm not, political movements and parties don't really mean much to me, in the same way that and I can't take credit for this coinage. This is my friend Quinn, but like with Nietzsche, I often say that I don't consider him very much of a political thinker because I don't think he gives a damn about the polis, like the Greek polis, the city-state, and because you see that the polis comes and goes, and whatever, like, let's say that the way you described, like the Roman Republic becomes the Roman Empire, right? It will obviously still kind of carry on the lineage of what America was. But whatever America transforms into in the next 30 or 40 years, it will not be the same country that it is now, basically. The 90s are never coming back. It's so funny how so much of our politics is people trying to get back to the 90s, funnily enough. Or, whatever they perceive as like okay, let's just freeze time right here when things were good. As if the developments at that time didn't directly flow into why we're at the place that we're in right now. And so, yeah, I would completely agree. I think in many ways, the funny thing is people treat decadence and corruption and all of these things as inherently a bad thing. And in Nietzsche's writing, he's actually far more ambivalent. He's actually far more, he sees life as fundamentally tragic, and he also wants to reveal the beauty to us of that tragedy and why we should affirm that tragedy and the tragic nature of existence. So all states eventually crumble and fall, just like all human lives eventually end, right? We can't be precious about that and act like that doesn't happen. But then we need to be able to see the beauty in that process if we're going to say life is good, if we're going to say the political project has been worthwhile. It's worth it to create these civilizations that have cultures in them that can do all these beautiful things, right? And so he actually says in The Gay Science, which I'm doing a reading or a walkthrough of that book right now on my channel, and one of the things he says is that corruption, which he uses as like a synonym for decadence or what have you, he says that's just a nasty word for the autumn of a people. What is autumn? It's the late age of it's the time when the fruit falls off the trees, when you get the output of science and art and music and all of the beautiful things of culture. He says these are all decadent products. These only happen during this phase when the people are no longer concerned with these martial qualities and projects of military expansion, because that was sapping all of your energy when you were doing those things. And so he has kind of a actually positive view. He says, like, if you're living through this circumstance, you should acknowledge that and think of how you can best take advantage of that circumstance of living in that time. It's very different from, say, somebody like Oswald Spengler, who basically says, like, the time for being a poet is past. Like, you should devote yourself to being a great engineer or architect or something practical, because we're now in the modern age and the mechanistic age. So you should be mechanistic, and all the great poetry has already been written, so forget about it, right? Whereas Nietzsche would say, no, like, these periods will always come back where we will have sort of different times when you should seize that opportunity. And that actually in the autumn of a culture, that's when you should seize the opportunity to be, like, live this artistic life. And that's kind of what I tried to do, was like find that path, like you were talking about, that's sort of like dreamlike and foolish and idealistic in its way, going and driving across the desert and playing music and doing all that. But I've never been that committed to whatever political project, because I don't think that to me it's like a grand sort of drama, and it's driven by we always forget that it's actual human beings that are engaged in this struggle for power. That it's not actually a battle of ideas. It is actually a battle between people. There is an ideological element, but you can never ultimately separate the ideology from the person. And so to me, I look at something like the FDR presidency. A lot of people, especially on the right, will treat him as like a tyrannical figure. But I look at that and say, well, he saved the empire. I'm sure the Republicans in ancient Rome hated Augustus because the power of the Senate was completely neutered. But all of the institutions that established like the Roman Empire for what it was happened under Augustus and his reforms. And so it's sort of just like what Nietzsche calls trusting fatalism, like trusting that, okay, it'll either happen or it doesn't. I don't know what the future of my nation could be. Maybe I could have the humility to not like take on the destiny of an entire nation, right? And just live my own life. And I think maybe that's why you're kind of picking up on that. Like I look to more gravitate towards the psychological side of Nietzsche. Because I feel like Nietzsche helps us by giving us those tools to sort of psychoanalyze a lot of these things that are going on. It can give you some distance from it and then allow you to see what's going on now and live your life accordingly. And he basically says, I mean, with the eternal return idea, the best thing you could do is like perish attempting the great and impossible, something along those lines. And that's like the best use of your life. Nietzsche's not really concerned with creating these like static orders that persist through all time, because he knows that's like a fool's errand. Yeah. To Nietzsche, the point of the French state was Napoleon. It wasn't that Napoleon was useful because he created the modern French state, right? It was like this was a great life that justifies itself in some way. And how do you live your life in a way that it justifies itself as well? I don't know. I feel like I kind of rambled a little bit there, but no, it's that's kind of where I stand as far as like I've never been that invested in the political story, because I see it as like a story. I'm very entertained by it, but I don't like think that I need to have some hand in like shaping its destiny or something like that.
I think it's a very interesting topic, because a lot of like these topics are very emotional, not the way that we talk about them, but the way that these actually are experienced by people day to day. And I experience them as well. You know, you go out and like it's fair enough. You speak to anybody in the right wing and they're like, the West is literally falling in free fall. We are declining. There was an age of greatness and it's not our time. And they're destroying our countries and our civilizations. And they're eviscerating us and replacing us and all this. And there's a moral decadence and everything's breaking apart. Everybody's on OnlyFans, you know, they're like, what is happening? Everything's falling apart. Do we need Islam? You know, this is what people are saying. And you actually, like, right. You understand, because you look around, it's all true. Like, there is this sort of degradation and decay. And it's actually a really critical question to ask, because if you get this wrong, it's like music, you know, your timing's off, and you don't want your timing to be off here, because you say to yourself, wait, all right, we have to think in terms of processes. This is a great Nietzschean innovation, is to understand history in terms of processes, understand reality in terms of processes. So we live within a process. Which process? Like, are we at the end of the Roman Republic, about to transition into an empire? That's a big question, because that means that we should be like radically politically engaged, like sort of Bolshevik revolutionaries prepared to reform everything and create like essentially a golden age. Pax Romana came after the empire, you know, after Augustus. Or is it a situation where it's like ancient Athens? The victory had been won. They had climbed the hill, and now we're sort of in this foundation stone where there's going to be this like just space where we're going to have just enough stability to hold everything together, where it's actually our job now to kind of dive into ourselves and just mine out of ourselves the maximum amount of art and culture. And as I said, like that, it's like a feminine approach to become like, oh, we all become feminine and we decide to birth. We destroy ourselves. We give up on us being like powerful rulers on ordered forces and all this. And instead we say that the job for our task, our time, is to go deep into science, go deep into AI, go deep into culture, see how far we can push music, see how far we can push technological music, and just sort of let the disintegrating happen. It's almost like a psychedelic trip, you know. You just sort of say, I'm just going to let the DMT destroy my face. I'm going to let everything melt, and I'm just going to keep going into it. And that's a significantly different attitude that I think defines an awful lot of the liberalism in opposition to the right wing, which is saying, no, we must resist these disintegrating forces or we will lose everything. And the thing is that I can see an argument for both sides. And if either one is right, the other one is fundamentally existentially wrong. And there's a big problem there, you know. There's a really, really big problem there. So I don't know what you think of that.
Well, that's why they want to conscript you onto their team, because they see it as that existential issue. For me, so this is where it's like my opinion is I almost hesitate to say it because it comes off as too reactionary, but I'm so disinterested in democracy that it's very hard for me to imagine coming together as part of, because all of these problems or all of these solutions to the problem are incredibly modern in their approach. Like we have to get together on our side and stir up all this sort of populist sentiment and enthusiasm for our political ideology and build our team and our party infrastructure and overcome theirs. And I feel a lot more like Heraclitus, who, you know, when the Greeks had that ritual of ostracism where they would vote every year to banish one person from the city-state, which I think is amazing. But
that's like, imagine that version of canceling. Imagine if that was going on. People
like you're actually canceled. Like you're exiled to the woods. Like, and there's barbarians out there too.
Yeah, imagine
but
that.
They banish Heraclitus's friend Hermodorus, who, according to Heraclitus, you know, he's his friend, but he's like the best and brightest of their society. And Nietzsche actually says he thinks that this is part of the reason for ostracism, because the whole Greek society is based on competition. So, you know, if Magnus Carlsen's like winning the chess tournament every single year, then it's kind of boring because you know who's going to be the champion. So Nietzsche's theory is because the Greeks hate autocracy so much and they love competition between equals, they use ostracism to banish whoever the best person is, basically. And that's at least Heraclitus's understanding of what happened with his friend. That part of it was political. There was like a political faction that didn't like him, but he basically sees like, wow, this is what it's always going to be. And so what does he do? He retreats from society and goes, and he's like playing dice games with kids in the Temple of Artemis. And when the elders come to see him, he says, it's better to do this than to participate in your civic life. And it's because you sort of realize that you're not, you and your individual ideas are never represented in democracy, because your vote doesn't represent an individual. It represents a party, or it represents a coalition, or it represents some sort of group interest, basically. That's always the basis of democracy, is some sort of group interest coming together for a coalition. And so that whole logic, I think, of having to integrate yourself with a sort of, party line or something like that. I mean, Nietzsche writes numerous things against this. He says, by his nature, the party man becomes a liar, because you have to dishonestly kind of like ignore half the truth a lot of the time. And a lot of the time, these parties are just sort of like a temperamental association between, like you mentioned, like there's like sort of like the masculine and feminine like elements here, right? And I know these are kind of vague terms and they can be overgeneralizable, but we know which party skews more towards like the masculine like tendencies and more towards the feminine. And a lot of that is just like, there's actually nothing wrong with it. Those are two aspects of human society, is the masculine and feminine, right? People who are going to skew a certain way are going to have that kind of attitude. I probably sound kind of like old school Jordan Peterson right now saying this, because he would make this point a lot, that basically they need each other, right? That there's sort of like the innovators and the people who think outside of the box and the people who preserve the old order and something like that. But that's actually not even the point that I would make necessarily. I don't think that they necessarily need each other in some sort of equilibrium. I think it's just a fact that people are going to sort themselves according to their temperament, and that it doesn't have to do necessarily with, persuading people to use their rational faculties. I mean, to bring it back to Freud, I believe it was his cousin or his nephew, Edward Bernays, the great advertising guru. He was the one who changed the entire game of advertising in the United States in the 1920s by applying Freud's theories, because advertising at that time, if you look at before Bernays came along, what would the ads? They'd be like in a magazine, and it would be all information. It'd be like, let me give you all the specs of the hardware you're going to buy and how it works and why it's a good idea to buy it. And it's basically the form of a logical argument for why you should buy this product. And Bernays says, fuck that. People respond to desires, fears, hopes, stupid impulses, basically, that they're not even aware of. And I'm sure you know the story. Like, the most famous story with him is where he wants to get women to smoke, which was considered a masculine activity. So he has a bunch of feminists at a suffragette rally light cigarettes and call them freedom torches. And so in no world is smoking good for women, but he gets them to argue for it as a social issue that will advance women, which, you know, it makes no sense from a health standpoint, but that's how we're driven. And that's how we're driven politically as well. And a lot of, like, this upcoming presidential election is just going to be driven by how people feel about the candidate and the general vibe that they get. Because I could go, I know everyone's tired of this, so I'm not going to make the argument. I could go down the list for an America First person who believe, and according to their own principles, dismantle Trump's first presidency. Be like, here are all the ways he wasn't America First. They don't care. They like the vibe of Trump. And similarly with Kamala Harris, it's like, oh, you're an ACAB, like, anti-authoritarian lefty. So you're going to vote for the cop prosecutor who kept, like, African Americans in jail longer than their sentence, and her office actually made the argument that they needed them for cheap labor. It would be a hit to the state of California's labor force if they let out people who had been proven innocent on appeal. They argued to keep them in jail longer.
Maybe
it's like,
maybe the right wingers should be voting for Kamala.
Right? Yeah. Like, when you hear stuff like that, I've actually thought about that. I was like, you know, we might see the what's that guy's name? Richard Spencer might very well endorse Kamala Harris for that reason.
I'd say he probably would. I'd say he probably would. Yeah.
I think that's going to happen. He's going to endorse her for that reason, basically. So yeah, but that doesn't matter. Like, you could explain all of that, but that doesn't matter because there's like a vibe to Kamala Harris, right? There's something she represents in their head, and that's representative of a certain temperament of thinking. And so all of this is like just sort of my way of saying, like, I don't know that we actually changed any of that. And that even the people who are like, you know, on the left wing or on the right wing fringe, who are like, really like, this is the existential moment and we need to be geared up and like ready for it. They have a certain temperament that's making them feel that way, and a certain set of circumstances that has created that. And apparently it's not enough to make it mainstream. Now, maybe it will be one day, right? But I sort of feel like that Jung might be useful here too, because that almost seems like it's something that like moves through the crowd that isn't really in the individual agency of any one person. Like, and that's the way that I tend to see it. It's like, in a way, maybe that's what I've been trying to get at with democracy this entire time. Part of the whole problem with democracy is that the force that moves through the crowd, the waves that pushes them in one direction or another, are these unconscious psychological forces that I don't feel like anyone really understands, and that I don't feel like I could control, and I don't want to control, and I don't want to have any part in. And I'm very much on board with Nietzsche saying we should articulate what kinds of values will be healthy to carry forward into the future. I think that's very important. And so I'll always stand for things like we need to have an education in the classics. People need to be politically and economically educated and historically educated and all of these things. And that we need to have these values of health and character and virtue and so on and so forth. And I think even, I disagree with these people a lot, but even the vitalists are saying go get jacked. Like, I think there's a lot of health, benefit to that as well. Even the left-wingers, I'll give this up to the left-wingers who say read theory. Yeah, go read theory. Better yourself, right? But I don't think that on the level of, I do see it as like waves and like almost just like clashing forces of sort of like these, Jung would describe it as, I believe it's in The Undiscovered Self, where he talks about how atomized we are as a society and how 1,000 zeros will never equal a one. And that basically, therefore, like the archetypes kind of have free reign to like ripple through society, pushing us in whatever direction. That's sort of how I see the play of forces in the democratic landscape. And so I don't think it can be controlled, and I don't think it can be predicted.
So there's so much that you said there that's so crucial. I actually think it cuts to like one of Nietzsche's most famous ideas, one of his maybe even simplest, but it doesn't mean it's not profound, which is the conflict between the individual and the herd. And you're describing the democratic process and democracy, and like, you know, it's herd morality by definition. It's probably the case fucking study on herd morality. And I know this, and you know this, and lots of people know this, and I'm sure there's lots of Nietzscheans who'd be listening. You know, they'd know this, but we get caught up in it. I get caught up in it. You know, you kind of sort of say, you like, this is the future. The West is falling. Destiny. We have to rally behind this. We have to rally behind that. But we need to do this politic thing and all this. And there is power in it as well. It's important to understand that it does have an effect to some extent. But there is. You're absolutely right. I think Gustave Le Bon talks about this. The crowd, where there's this just unbelievably ruthless problem about all this, where the crowd is demonic. The crowd cannot have a complicated thought. It cannot have sophisticated syntax. It cannot have, like, you know, statement with qualifier. It cannot think that way. It must be like immigrants bad, or like white people racist. It has to be just blunt and stupid and simple. And in some sense, if you want to lead a crowd, you just have to learn how to stir those up and correctly, like, kind of suck energy out of them and do all this. And so it seems like that's the kind of what politics has turned into. I think something very, very cynical about even Kamala and Trump that's coming up at the moment is seeing how explicitly the two professional politicians, the best minds in politics in the modern world, who are definitely in those two parties right now, have realized that it descends down into no sophisticated stuff. Because I even enjoyed seeing, like, JD Vance come out and talk about, like, tech and futurism and Musk getting excited. Like, you know, maybe there's going to be interesting possibilities that they try new stuff there. I thought it was cool. But all of a sudden, when it kind of comes down to it, it's like that gets stripped out. And Kamala's process and project is going on TikTok and being like quirky girl and all this. And you're realizing that they understand. It's very sophisticated. It's marketing, you know. They've understood that white women is their demographic. They got to appeal to them. And that's how the campaign is going to be ran now. It's going to be quirky girl, get the girl on side, girl party, girls night out type thing. And it's clever and it makes sense, and I completely understand why they do it. But that's sort of what things seem to descend down into. And this is difficult. It's very difficult for a sensitive soul, you know, very difficult for a sensitive soul who's saying to yourself, like, your job in this life is I guess it's like that Nietzschean thing, you know, you're given this quantum of will to power, and you have 40, 50 years to spend it. And if you spend it in party politics, it gets absorbed in that, and you just better want to make sure it's worth it. You know, I'm sure maybe Adolf Hitler was like, it paid off. You know, it got me to become the ruler of a country. But most people will get, like, sucked up into it. This type of thing, it gets dissipated, it gets wasted or something like this on ineffectual stuff or nonsense. You know, it won't be world historical. It won't make a difference. And then you also wonder, again, it's a timing thing. In our era, is it probably better for us to be, I don't know, diving into our minds and trying to cut and get, like, a new understanding of what are the right values for us to carry forward, or go into AI, or go into technology, or try to create a music for the future? Or is that silly, and is that going against trends? Like, all of these things are fascinating. I think of it like a classical musician. They could be like Beethoven level skill and creativity, but all they'd end up making in our age is film music, you know. And you compare that to, like,
yeah,
a dude with the same talent, maybe even slightly less talent, but he goes into, like, trying to synthesize rock and rap, and successfully does this, you know, and creates a new style, or techno and rap or something, and he creates something new, or psychedelic trance and something, and he creates something new, and his creativity is innovative, and he'd get remembered forever. And the other guy would be forgotten as, like, a kind of backrooms kind of thing. So it's very interesting to think, like, how that energy can get sponged up, and you kind of have to think to yourself if you're aiming in the right direction.
Well, it's interesting how, well, because you the way you were talking about it earlier about how, like, what this contest comes down to, it really comes down to memes. They're, like, competing with memes now.
Yeah.
Like, they're doing the whole thing, like, JD Vance is weird, Trump is weird, right? And a lot of the right-wing response has been to say, like, we're not weird, you're weird.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
it's like,
It's like,
you can't ever do that. You can't ever be like, no, I'm not, it's you. You have to ignore what they're saying and make sure your meme succeeds harder, basically. Like, Trump before this was always he was the guy who could make any nickname stick to someone, and things stick to him. He's Teflon Don. Like, everything just falls off of him because there's a new thing a week later, and there's already a new news cycle, and you already forgot the last thing he said, right? Like Trump made some statements that people have interpreted recently that he a promise to end democracy. I don't think that's actually what it was in context, but where he was saying like,
Nietzsche and Trump.
"Oh, my beautiful Christians, if you vote once, you'll never have to do it again," like basically, and it's like people got outraged about that, but there will be another thing in a week, right? There will be another thing that he said, and then they'll forget about the last thing they were outraged by. So they need to like play to that, and don't let them stick like that label on them, right? But anyway, aside from my like strategic gaming out of meme warfare, the fact that it is meme warfare, right? Like memes, I think we don't sufficiently realize. I think a lot of people really overestimated the meme in terms of like the actual like, I don't know, social value or something like that. Because they saw how like Trump got memed into office the first time, and that there was this sort of, well, a meme among the right that like, hey, memes are actually pretty smart. Like they tell you the real truth. It's like the stand-up comedian telling you the thing that, you know, everyone knows but they don't want to say, right? Leaving out the fact that, you know, political cartoons going back centuries have often taken the form of the meme of like the Chad and the Soy Wojaks. And there's even the meme that we're all familiar with of like, oh, great point. Too bad I made you the Soy Wojak, right? And not realizing like this is a propaganda format. This is an ideal way to do a propaganda war is through memes because they're like hieroglyphs in a way, right? They're pictorial. The information can travel even faster than. That's why everyone makes fun of the wall of text wordy memes because they're not utilizing the real power, the pictorial power of the meme to just like hook into your brain. And that would be my like whole take on it is like it's very sad that that's the level that politics is being battled out on, because it's almost like when you have a meme war, you've actually stripped away any possibility for dialogue and you're just engaging in pure propaganda. It's just purely trying to manage the perception, the emotional level of perception. It's that Edward Bernays strategy, right? But I guess the sad thing about that is like it kills whatever last like idealistic liberal idea that I had, that like, you know, like the Jordan Peterson idea of like, we're going to both have a dialogue and we'll get to the truth, right? It basically eliminates that. We're way past that now.
So to even add on top of that, apologies to interrupt, but to even add on top of that in terms of the black pill, I'm about to serve you up another plate, my sir. But it's also this idea of like, we could have, you know, say we had Mozart sitting around. Because of the just unbelievable raw power of the internet, like a lot of people are going to get hoovered up into this. It's like, you know, libido. This is the psychoanalytic term for soul energy, creative energy, just gets harvested up into these giant sloshes of like bickering about like, am I weird? Is my guy JD Vance weird? Like it's like this dude could be splitting the atom again, you know, this dude could be figuring out how to create a bicameral hemisphere for artificial intelligence. This dude could be, as I said, innovating a new form of music or something like this, or fixing Hollywood. But instead it's just all sloshed up with this like, and like I could understand if it was revolutionary politics. I think actually Trump in 2016, people talk about the memes, but they misunderstand how revolutionary he was. Fuentes, the hard right winger, like he's very against Trump recently, and he's saying this, you know, he's saying sort of like, oh, back then Trump was basically like, we're gonna take away the special interests and we're gonna get rid of the globalists, and he's just not talking that way now. You know, we're gonna dismantle the media, and nowadays he's just not. It's not as he's talking about like tax cuts and inflation, and it's funny because they're like it's kind of really tepid. It's sort of like it's like management. It's like we've got new policies to manage the company. It's not like we're going to literally knock the building over and build something new. And so all this talent gets harvested up into this kind of tepid, weak stuff if you think about it. And that's a scary thing about politics, because it's so important in some sense, but then it also harvests so much energy on such petty bullshit. Like it's just so nonsensical. So you really have to wonder and see where it goes. That being said, I don't want to put out the idea that it's not consequential. I actually was speaking about on Twitter how something a lot of people missed on that French Revolution Olympics introduction is they had an image of Marie Antoinette when Gorgia were on the stage. And of course, like Marie Antoinette was one of the first victims of cancel culture. They memed her into losing her head because she never said let them eat cake. She never said she was like very polite. She was like, you know, quite a much better person than she was made out to be. But the media at the time very effectively waged a campaign, slander war against her, and got her executed as a consequence, which is pretty brutal. So it does matter. These things do matter, and I guess it's just a tragic part of our world, unfortunately.
Well, I mean, that's the thing. So when we're talking about this sort of like dispassionately, I think you brought this up earlier. Like, if you actually live through, like, it's one thing to talk about like the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. If you were to live through that, it would be a horrific experience. I mean, it would be hard to watch even a lot of it happen for a modern person, much less to go through it. Um, and so maybe to use an analogy, because like the thing is, like as you mentioned, there's a lot of people on the far right who are like, we're in this existential crisis. And then there's a lot of people on the far left who will look at Trump and be like, he's an existential crisis. That's the end of democracy, and so on and so forth. Or just the general sort of like, we're speeding towards neo-feudalism, where everything is owned by like a handful of billionaires or something like that. Whereas the right wing is looking at more like all the nations will be dissolved. And, you know, there is some truth actually to both of those. But if, again, well, to use an analogy to a current geopolitical conflict, and I guess I'll say their names this time, you know, like if you look at put yourself in the position of an Israeli or a Palestinian, I can understand why either one of those people in that position sees themselves in an existential struggle, right? And I, as somebody who is not involved in that struggle in any way, it would be really blasé of me to be like, hey, just, you know, let Hamas operate freely, or hey, just let Gaza get leveled and completely turned into glass. Like, who cares, right? It's just the forces of history, bro. There's nothing you can do about it, right? Like, that would all be very callous, and I wouldn't say it to them. I think what's relevant for me, though, is like, I always try and keep in mind, like, what is actually within my control and my, like, sphere of influence, and like what am I actually doing in my life. Like a lot of the time when people start talking politically, they're speaking as if like if I were the god king of our current civilization, like I'm playing a game of Civ 6, this is what I would do to fix America. And it's like, well, that's not the situation at all. The vast majority of people have absolutely no power. And even the people who appear to have power, like, you know, people who thought AOC was going to go in and be a revolutionary, or people like Nick Fuentes who thought Trump was going to go in and be a revolutionary. Robert Michels, the political theorist from turn of the century, like 1900, I believe it was like 1901 when this book came out, wrote a study called Political Parties, where he establishes the iron law of oligarchy. And one of the dynamics he points out is how any sort of like revolutionary or like disturbing or hostile element to the system that tries to enter into the system and change it from within is eventually just kind of integrated into it. And they actually end up serving like a very useful role for on behalf of the system, because then previously revolutionary thinkers are like, oh, there's a home for me within the system, right?
It's this guy proves opposition, yeah.
Right. But one of the interesting things of what Michels does is, because it's a sociological study, it's not and everything he says is numerous examples. I mean, it's a book like this thick, because basically every point he makes, he's like, let me give you all these examples of exactly this happening. And it's all within socialist parties too, that are ostensibly supposed to be egalitarian. And that's what he starts out with, that point that if I was talking about monarchist parties or aristocratic parties, you'd expect they'd be kind of oligarchic in their structure. But the socialist parties do it too. And so his theory at the end was human beings just naturally like they're the entropic mode, or the thing that what entropy of any human social arrangement pushes toward, is oligarchy. We always coalesce into these sort of like hierarchical oligarchical structures, and that it's not like because there's a conspiracy or like it is controlled opposition. That's exactly the term for it. But a lot of people use that to mean like, oh, they got paid off or something like that. Kind of what he points out is like let's take the example of AOC. Whether or not you believe she's actually going to be a revolutionary voice in Congress, right? Or agree with her politics on any level. Put yourself into the mindset of a progressive leftist, and you're excited that AOC got elected. She doesn't need to be bought off by anyone to realize like, hey, I'm getting like healthcare, I'm getting like a giant pension, and I have like 5 million followers on Twitter. I'm like a celebrity. I should actually not fuck this up. Like the whole platform I ran on of like, let's raise a ruckus and protest in Nancy Pelosi's office. Well, she still kind of can do that, but it becomes all kind of like theatrical, right? And it's like whatever intention there might have been to disturb things, you get integrated into the system, and you basically all of your personal incentives are against you actually being a revolutionary element. And that's so I think that dynamic basically makes it to where even the people who ostensibly have power, a lot of the time, what they can't mount any effective resistance against is an incentive structure. They can't mount any effective resistance against the internal logic of a bureaucracy where everyone just sort of voluntarily acts a certain way because it's in their best self-interest. And they don't actually have to be run by some sort of like conspiracy in a dark room. It's just the fact that, like, hey, this is the way the system works. And it personally benefits me not to rock the boat. And that's how I tend to see things. That I think that's another book I'd highly recommend is Robert Mickle's Political Parties. It's a lot of it is old politics, but you'll see if you read through that book, you'll see all the same patterns in politics today. Like the way that the parties, like they control the purse, they control who gets paid, they control the distribution of information. How there's like a specialization gap between the ordinary person and the like political insider or activist, basically. How they gain like a really specialized knowledge, and the voter can't become specialized in their knowledge of every single topic. So there's all these advantages that basically they gain in holding on to their power.
That actually makes so much sense, because in Ireland, obviously, there's rumblings of revolutionary energy, I guess you could say, and an awful lot of Irish nationalists, like they'd be right wingers, are coming up against this very blunt problem that people like this have been speaking about. Is that, like, say if you wanted to change the system, say let's run with some theses here. You may disagree or agree, but the feeling of being replaced, the immigration problem, all this. Well, say you wanted to stop that. Like, how exactly would you go about stopping it? And you might say, well, I'll go and I'll do a protest. And what happens is the police show up, and then you might even scare the police off, but nothing's going to change. Why is nothing going to change? You say, all right, well, what I'll do is I'll get a political party. So you organize all your boys, and they go in, they get elected into power. But they can't change things. So you think to yourself, why? Why can't they? That's weird. Because, and this is what happened to Trump in 2016, you get into power. Putin spoke about this with Obama. I remember hearing this, Obama, Putin says he was an idealistic man, and he got into power, and he had all these big ideas about how he's going to change things. And he sits down in the White House day one, and he's like, all right, guys, bring in the magic wand, and I'll start changing stuff. And then some guy shows up in a suit with a suitcase, and he sits down and says, and Obama's like, who the fuck are you? I've never seen you before. And he's like, yeah, I'm part of the bureaucracy. This suitcase contains all the things that we're going to do. We've listed your policies. We're going to be able to achieve these ones, and we want to achieve these ones. These are the ones that you said. These are the things you said that we can't do, and these are the things you said that we won't do. Sign here, and we'll get them all done for you. And Obama might say, no, I want to do everything. It's like, how are you going to do it? How are you going to change anything? We run the country. We run the passport office. We run the staffing of the military. We run this, we run that. Us, nameless bureaucrats who are not voted in. We've got jobs. We run everything. If you want to change anything, you need to change us. And we do everything. And if you don't get us on side, we just won't help you. We'll just run the government without you.
That's why Lenin had the basically ripped out all of the existing bureaucrats. During the Bolshevik Revolution, he was like, well, we'll hold on to the institutions, but like literally everyone is getting overhauled because they need to be like in line with our ideas, basically.
Exactly. And that's what, and Bismarck also said, it's like, look, you can have bad laws, but if you have good bureaucrats, you'll get a lot done. If you have the best laws, if you're a genius of legislation, and you go in, you're Moses in the level of legislation, you go in and you have bad civil servants or hostile civil servants, and nothing will happen. Because the machine is ran by people, this type of thing. And so Trump gets in, and his administration is kind of hostile to him. And I think that happened with him recently, where there was that Project 2025 plan that they're grilling Vance on. And part of that was gut out 50,000 administrative staff members. And that's like, that's Lenin. That's going for the jugular. And so obviously the system just targets that like a razor beam, because it's like, that can't happen. And it's a very big problem. It's actually a very fascinating problem, because as you were also saying about Mickelson, is that all those administrators and all those people in politics understand this. Once you start to study this, you start to realize, like, this is how things actually work. The average person spending all their time watching politicians on television has no idea about this stuff. They don't understand how these systems work. And so all their energy gets sponged up in, like, it's literally tabloid news. that's completely missing the point. And they could be disgusted about the way that their world is transforming, but they just don't understand the nature of the situation, so they can't really do anything about it. And it's a very, very weird situation we find ourselves in, because it kind of, I kind of think it sort of invalidates the principles of democracy. And I'm not saying that as an accusation against the system. It's almost like a fulfillment of what all the ancient philosophers said, is that democracy always ends up in tyranny, because, professionals will come in and run the show, that type of thing. So
or kleptocracy. It's basically that the ancient Greek authors believe that basically once you transition to democracy, the degenerate form of that is, I believe, called holocracy, and it's basically where factions just use political power to just take what they want for themselves, reward their friends, and punish their enemies. And without regard, one of the things that Fustel de Coulanges in the Ancient City points out is that because the Greeks didn't even have a concept of private property, so they didn't have the benefit of the English tradition saying, like John Locke and figures like this, who said like, oh, well, what you make is yours, what you've transformed with your labor is yours. And this is where the wealth of nations comes from, Adam Smith and all these thinkers like this. The Greeks didn't have any of these concepts of individual private property. So they basically said the state is all powerful, or that was like their implicit assumption, is like the state is this divinely sanctioned thing. So as soon as democracies take hold, they say, well, why can't we just vote that we're going to take all the rich people's stuff and give it to us? There's no reason why we can't do that. And I think a lot of the rise of tyrants during this period was that a strong man becomes incredibly attractive to people when governments are constantly rising up to do that, to just basically have competing kleptocracies of like, well, we're going to vote to take your stuff. No, we're going to vote to take your stuff. People scream out for a tyrant, basically. And even the tyrant, because their rule isn't established on any legitimate means, meaning in those times religious means, they got assassinated all the time as well. And so, yeah, I think just like you were bringing up the Roman Empire earlier, the I guess this would be in like 5th and 4th century Greece, during the time of Theognis and onward. That is also very similar to what we're probably going to start seeing increasingly in America, and have seen in the past, in the period in the Great Depression and leading up to that. But yeah, like I think that again, if you were one of the people living in those Greek city-states, like Nietzsche wrote his dissertation on Diogenes, who's a poet, who was an aristocrat. And his poetry is a record of him saying, okay, when I was growing up, like the aristocrats were esteemed and had like religious dignity. And now, like we have our stuff seized by the proletarians and we're treated like dogs in the street. And he got exiled and he had to live in like all these different cities and everything. And he comes back and he's very disturbed to see like the whole class system has like basically been totally blurred, right? Like plebeians have become rich, patricians have become poor, they're all intermarrying. And, some of his poems, he's like, Zeus, why have you forsaken us, basically? I thought you only rewarded the good men, and you're rewarding these like low-born like barbarians who have basically come into our city. Because a lot of the way that the Greeks actually saw the plebeians, or the people who are outside of the city walls, it wasn't like today where we're like, okay, they're lower class, but they're still like American citizens, right? There's like kind of a thing about being an American citizen, regardless. It's very similar to all being equal in the eyes of God. You could be a complete poor bum, drunken wastrel, but goddamn it, you're an American, right? There is something like that. They did not have this with the plebeians. They were like, these are people without a cult, without a religion. They're not part of the tribe. They're basically like no better than barbarians, right? And so he witnessed this period of social upheaval that, according to the Greeks, I mean, this is what Aristotle comes to the conclusion, was probably an inevitable cycle of history. And of course, Diogenes absolutely hates it. But one of the things that I noticed from reading Nietzsche's dissertation is that he seems to see like that resentment build up in Diogenes, and how he says he's already been corrupted by this process, basically. He's let himself become vindictive and sort of like poisoned by what's happened. And spends a lot of his time, I mean, a lot of his younger poems, he's talking about just enjoying his youth and drinking wine and flirting with girls. His later poems are like these. Nietzsche says he's got a Janus head. So he's like basically Janus, the two-headed god of Rome, that he became milder outwardly and very nice and gentlemanly and forgiving. But his poems are like these angry screeds So basically, there's nothing he can do to establish the order again in his society, and his poems become this like resentful outlet. And I don't know. I guess I see a lot of the of theogonists on the right wing today.
That's a really
And
good
my
observation.
advice to them would be to again look to what Nietzsche said and like how do there's a guy on Twitter or X named Hickman who's like he's in the US. He's like a traveling. He tries to like live on like the lowest means he possibly can. And he travels around a lot. He tells people, gives people tips on how to hitchhike from county to county, how to see the whole country, how to like live on a budget. He'll go to like small town and be like, look, you can get a job in this town for like 35 grand a year and get this fixer upper. And basically telling people like, hey, yeah, like I'm not going to say all these problems aren't real, but as like part of like traditional Americana, you can carve out your like life. You can have a completely fulfilling life if you apply all of those things like discipline and hard work that we're always talking about, right? And so I really like admire him. And then there's also people, you know, on the left hand. Well, see, on the left it's kind of hard because if like you're a utopian socialist, you can kind of never be satisfied. But you know, I tend to like actually. This is like a dirty word now, but I like a lot of the postmodern left, honestly, because they again, you know, people like Foucault ultimately, I think we're a lot more realistic than a lot of the more utopian people. And that's another person who was very psychologically influenced and very much influenced by Nietzsche. So yeah, I don't know. I'm all about that. Like, embrace the reality of what's happening right now. Think about what you can actually control and do with your life.
I love that. I think that's actually like again, it comes to that theme where we talk about process, and it's like, are we in the decline of the West? And Nietzsche's really, it's like amor fati 101. If you are, how do you embrace it and make the most out of it and do the correct role? You know, because maybe this is a time for injecting, pollinating the world with new ideas. Like this is the last gasp. In fact, the kind of fact that this is actually such a fascinating way of thinking, because it's Nietzsche forces you to feel this way, you know? So if we didn't feel that it was all about to end, would we maybe have enough drama inside of ourselves to produce something interesting? Because if you're like, holy shit, we're staring down the cliff, it's all about to collapse. If you actually can let that into your soul, that actually gives you this like almost perfect tragic feeling that you're like literally you're like the encore. Like you kind of say the music our generation can make, the stories, the myths, the philosophy, we could be like, we're conscious that we're the final nihilists. We're the end. This is going down. Ship is going to end. We're never going to live. We're not going to live for 20 years and see the revolution. And so our job is to just sort of be like, last hurrah, prepare for the next kind of phase or something like this. And that's
it's gratitude as well.
Yeah.
It's a great path to gratitude, to basically say like, wow, this is really an amazing thing that we have here. Yeah. It makes you appreciate it, right?
That's fascinating. That's a very interesting mindset, because I don't think I see that anywhere. I really don't. I don't think I see that. And that's a fascinating thought of like that particular artistic feeling of like, all right, your job is the encore. Your job is like, you're like the guys in the Titanic. As it's about to sink,
I like that.
You have to like get a banger out before you can. And that's it could, you know, there might be dead people around when it's happening, but you got to do it. That type of thing. That's a fascinating idea. That's
right.
The way you.
It's not fun to die on the Titanic.
Yeah, no, it's not going to end well.
The band playing at the end of the Titanic. The band playing as the Titanic goes down, that's an amazing image. Yeah. I'm glad you brought that up.
Let's go.
Because how based is that, dude? Can you imagine like how badass you would feel going out that way?
I like 100%. I think about it, and again, particularly with that feeling, because I think maybe 20 years ago, there was a sort of sterility that everybody feels now had set in culturally. Like people say, like, look at Hollywood and all this. There's a very big cultural sterility with Hollywood, because they're trying to force a utopia that people don't feel is going to happen. You know, they're trying to say that like, we're going to do this diversity, LinkedIn diversity, and it's going to work out, guaranteed. And people know it's not going to work out. And so it feels inauthentic. Now, it's fascinating if you started to make movies or films, if there was an artistic movement that was like fundamentally pessimistic. Because remember, Nietzsche spoke about this strong pessimism that he saw in the Greeks. If you were like, it's fun, like Western culture is fucked. So it's kind of like acknowledging the right's power, if you will. But then it was sort of like fatalistic, nihilistic, and actually weirdly liberal. in that like we're going down with the ship, we're going down with the degeneracy, it's all coming apart at the seams, like a psychedelic trip, you know, where it's all going, and our job is to make like the most crazy bang as it goes out. That's a very different tone. It's like, it is truly tragic, but also very, very assertive, because you're like diving headfirst into it. Whereas most other people are like, oh, they're trying to hold together this Titanic. Other people are being like, it's not sinking, it's fine, we're going fine. And it's like, no, it's like correctly getting everything together. That's quite interesting. It's quite interesting.
Well, it's funny actually the way you put it though, because I would even say I'm more intellectually humble about my predictions for the future, to the point where I would say like I see all the problems that they're talking about, but I'm even willing to say like I have no idea how it's going to play out. Like it could very well be that like in 40 years like we're having like a new renaissance. And that's one of the things you note when you study like the history of Europe, for example, that like in the time of the 13th century, or I guess it would be the 14th century, like the 1300s, Europe went through basically an almost apocalyptic series of events. I mean, if you were alive at that time, you would be justified in saying this really is the end times. Yeah. This has to be the end times. Like Jesus is coming back over that hilltop any moment now, because a third of the population's been killed. And the way that medieval authors, historians describe it, traveling through France during that time, they describe it like almost like a zombie apocalypse, where they say like all the fields are overgrown. The towns are like, there's no people in them. Everyone's like, the like signs of life are like people huddled in these like castles and fortresses, basically, and if they see a stranger, everyone runs in the fortress. Like they just till the fields just around that. Everything else is overgrown. And like 100 years before that, Paris was like the center of like the entire like European civilization. It was the most splendid city and the most populous city in Europe. And so we've like been through the apocalypse many times before, and we've Renaissance, rebirth, that has happened many times before as well. And so there is almost like I think the idea that so again, as I mentioned, I'm doing the read through of The Gay Science by Nietzsche, and a lot of people have like, there's disputes about how you should translate that text, because a lot of people say the joyful science, and they'll say like, well, the word gay like has like a different meaning or whatever. But Walter Kaufmann points out part of the reason why Nietzsche chose that term is because that word had an association with like devil may care attitude, like being carefree in the sense of being like kind of playfully transgressive, like kind of pushing the boundaries a little bit and pushing the rules. And so it does mean joyful, but it's joyful in that kind of way, like almost like a prankster, or like again, devil may care type of attitude. And I think there's a real power to that, of like you said, you can acknowledge that you're fucked, and even saying like, but who knows? I don't know what the future holds. And I think that was the advantage that of a lot of religions, actually, that Nietzsche is trying to sort of rejuvenate, that trusting fatalism that people could have from thinking, well, it's all in the hands of God. Inshallah, like God willing, this will happen. And I think there is a real sort of like peace of mind that you can have even in the midst of like strife and struggle, when you say like, oh, it's all in God's hands. And I think part of the beauty of Nietzsche that's often missed, I don't think he was trying to get us to return to any sort of traditional religious ideas, but he was trying to look, practically speaking, like, okay, what were the benefits of Christianity? It gave a meaning to our suffering. It gave us something to sacrifice to. It gave us a future to believe in. All of these sort of things. And so one of those things it provided was that the man who is going to die defending his city walls says, it's all in God's hands. It doesn't matter. I can forget about the consequences and focus on living my ideal life. And that's, again, my sort of central driving principle and orienting thing. And that's why I don't spend any time in politics, because what I see in that is, like you say, people running around in these sort of like circles, chasing their own tail, having mimetic warfare, and getting swept away in like these tribal narratives and things like that. And maybe a time and place will come where there is like real political power, or like a real political decision that has to be made, right? I don't think we're really there, right? I think all of that is contextual, and you would have to like put yourself in that situation to know that it was actually happening. You'd have to be in that situation to know it was actually happening. But yeah, and so I think that trusting fatalism is like a really powerful attitude to bring to your life. And Nietzsche, he tries to achieve this with the eternal return. The problem is people are so modern and mechanistic with their viewpoint, they almost can't entertain the idea.
Yeah.
But what if my life was an eternally repeating down to every last same detail? In that case, you should live. I mean, to use the internet terminology, live your best life, right?
It's very true how like people, I've noticed this quite a bit where people get into these topics and they try to confront them like systematically or something like this, like like the God is dead thing. Richard Dawkins in the wake of this starts to read God is dead as like this sort of argument about the documentary evidence for like a creator. And it's like, where's the science to prove that above in the sky there's a creator? He's not there. So stupid Christians, stupid evangelicals and all this. And you see that and you misunderstand, like this completely misunderstands, for example, Nietzsche's criticism of like moral evaluations and talking about like the will to power and stuff like this. And so it's all lost on kind of a mechanistic way of trying to think or something like that. It's a good criticism to point out. But on your previous point, and I guess we will wrap it up soon because we've definitely reached a pretty good end point, first of all. But it actually reminded me of James Joyce when you were speaking about this. James Joyce, the Irish novelist, he wrote Ulysses, and Ulysses is in some sense almost like the perfect acknowledgement of absurdity and the realization that Western culture was going down in a weird way, or going down into something. And it's a very Nietzschean text. Actually, the first chapter ends with the main character making a Nietzschean statement. Thus spoke Zarathustra. He makes a reference to the Overman when he dives into the downgoing world. And the last statement in the book is a Nietzschean statement, an affirmation by Molly. She says, yes, 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 I will, yes. So it's like an embrace of life, that type of thing. And Joyce actually wrestled with this concept of Dionysus and Apollo quite a lot because he was big into the Greeks and he was trying to write a novel, and he was saying to himself, should I make it a tragedy or a comedy? That was the big question, because a tragedy is obviously a bad story where the heroes die. And he was wrestling with this quite a lot. Like, is the ultimate story, because you wanted to write the ultimate story, is the ultimate story that the hero dies? Is that it's like Jesus Christ in a weird way. It's the ultimate story, he dies, and then he comes to this sort of spiritual conclusion at some point that it's not. The ultimate story is that the something wins. There's something good happens, and that's you misunderstand life if you think that's not how it ends in the end. No matter how bad it gets, you misunderstand life if you think it doesn't end with a laugh, that type of thing. Because, like, first of all, we're here. We've overcome, as you said, like, the Black Death and the communist gulags and all this. Like, we've come over some crazy stuff. The Chinese went through the Great Leap Forward, and now they're one of the most powerful nations in the world. Like, it's bizarre to even just comprehend what that kind of means. And so Joyce is really trying to grab that inside his Ulysses. It's this fundamental destruction of the mind, this psychedelic breakdown of man coming into the 20th century and 21st century. The future is rattling him apart. And there's this feeling of loss of control and the breakdown of the old order. The second or third chapter in Ulysses is an Irish Protestant, so a British, Anglo-British, and he would have been the master race at this point, and he's lamenting the fall of the British Empire. He's saying, like, it's all getting lost, it's all dissolving and all this. And that was a big feeling at the time, because even Nietzsche references this, like the great British Empire was starting to slumber and slow. And Joyce goes through that, and at the end of it finds the acknowledgement, the affirmation, the amor fati, the yes, yes, yes at the end of it. So it's a proper way to think. We can maybe understand this in theory, but in order for us to digest it, we say, oh, all the black pills, Chud Jack saying the West has fallen. It's about being able to digest that and then have an affirmative view on the world. That's actually true psychological health, if you will. So if you've any thoughts to add on to that, and then maybe we can begin to wrap up.
Yeah, I guess just my final remark that, something you mentioned earlier was that, maybe with a lot of the, like, Hollywood and modern art that we see that's popular and mainstream now, that maybe they're trying to, like, force an agenda of some sort of utopia. But what I actually, to maybe disagree with that a little bit, but in a way that kind of ties into your overall point here, I actually see, like, so much of art now that's almost just, like, self-referential and meta and deconstructionist and very negative and dominated by anti-heroes and dystopia. And that seems to be a lot of our main focus now. It's very, like, there's very little in the way of articulating a positive vision for the future. And even that notion to people seems almost a little bit silly. in the way that most people now don't have heroes, right? That it's kind of like cliche, or like not cliche, but like that's kind of silly. That's the thing kids do, is have a hero, right? But I guess what I would say, and so I could see somebody listening to our whole conversation and saying, what are they talking about with the end of civilization being like the fruiting of all this great culture? So much of it is just this like self-referential deconstructionist, like depressing crap. And I think that's completely true to a large extent. But I think what's going on, like with this conversation right now, or so much of what's happening, sort of like, I guess, outside of the mainstream, if that makes sense. There's more opportunities now, and more like, you can look at the blockbuster films and say like, oh, look, it's the same slop over and over again. But making a film's never been easier. If you go digging and you go looking, and more than that, actually, it's never been easier to find the treasures of cinema from now like almost 100 years, like oftentimes freely available on YouTube. Anything before like the 50s or 60s, you could probably find it for free, right? And so, and then we have resources like Project Gutenberg, where you can find all the classics for free. And I think just the potential that exists right now for an artist to be sort of like cross-pollinated by all the great art that's ever been made. Because think about who actually had access to like all the great art that's ever been made in past decades before this sort of like technological revolutions we've had. And think about the barriers to entry of like the cost that are now completely gone, where we have like technology like the laptop that I'm using right now. That's, like, yeah, it's expensive, but like it's not like setting up a film studio, and people make whole films like with technology that's like freely available now. So I think I agree with like what you said, and what I would like to see is more people, I guess, to tie it back to Nietzsche and everything we are talking about. One of the things I like about the book The Gay Science is that it's Nietzsche's like the tragic philosopher, right? Like we've been talking about the pessimism of strength. It's the one book where Nietzsche seems to take the side of comedy and to interpret existence comedically, explicitly say he comes out against the tragedy of existence and said, no, from the grand, I think with that attitude, like you're saying, that story where at the end of it, something good happens, and that's basically the justification for the entire thing. I think the potential for stories like that now, for a new James Joyce, is greater than ever, basically. And that it's actually very likely that the lion's share, the vast majority of the great literature and everything that, like great art, culture, music, that's all yet to be written, because of just the sheer volume of effort and technology and energy that is possible, that exists in potentia right now. And so that to me is very exciting. And if you let go of worrying about like, what's my nation going to look like in 30 or 40 years? I understand, again, if you feel you're in that existential crisis, there are some people, like, I'm not going to tell you not to, like, you'll always have the sense and the beliefs that you have and the motivations you have that you deserve according to who and what you are. So if you're in that position, you're in that position. But if you're like us and you're sitting at home and you're basically like, well, I'm just an average guy in the Western world, I think you should focus on the great opportunities we have rather than the danger. Because the danger actually sweetens and enhances the opportunity in some ways, doesn't it? Like you're saying, like, would you have it in you to do this great thing if you didn't know that it was all temporary and it's all coming to an end? And like Nietzsche says, the certain fact of our death could be like a drop of honey that could sweeten life with its levity, but you alchemists and poison brewers have turned it into the most bitter pill to swallow, something of that nature. So that's my outlook. That's that's where I stand on this.
I think having good artistic instincts is something that we psychologically is not as common as it should be. Because like a real artist ultimately looks at the situation non-judgmentally, like a Buddhist, and says, what can I make out of this? This is a canvas. These are maybe all the colors are like crappy colors, but I can make something of them. And that's actually the fundamental instinct. And I think that's a very Nietzschean idea, It's like you're a child at play and you're serious about what's in front of you and you don't idealize. You don't romanticize, And that's a very, very big problem with people. And even say if you wanted to be a political revolutionary, like that's the way you would have to think, you know. Take Lenin, you brought up Lenin, you know, right. And you could imagine in Lenin's head, he probably knew that he was sort of casting a little bit of a lie, saying, yeah, equality, all this type of stuff. But he had a vision for what he wanted to modernize the Russian state and make it industrial power. And so he spun the lie. He organized the Platonic Project, and then he might have spilled a little bit of blood and got a little bit evil or whatever. But he was actually a very savvy operator, using the tools that was in front of him, using the imperfect situation that was in front of him. And so it's a fascinating. That's like a winner's mindset when you think about it. It's very, very in this world, pragmatic, dirty, willing to get your hands dirty, and that's actually the thing that does interestingly tilt history. Napoleon's another great example. During the French Revolution, probably was quite easy to turn around and be like, the West is over. They just killed a little fucking king, you know. And then Napoleon's like, yeah, well, I will pick up the crown with my sword, you know. So it's that type of thinking. So excellent. I think these are good rousing topics to end on, so I will wrap it up. Thank you very much for coming on. I'd love for you to tell us where we could find you and find your work, and if you have any plans or projects coming up.
Thanks, Steph. It's been my pleasure. I published a book this year. It's called The Ritual Madness of Rock and Roll. It is a account of my band's tour of Europe in 2019, so sort of a travelogue, and it includes a theory of art and aesthetics, an exploration of why, basically the motivation behind creating art, the relationship between the artist and the audience. I kind of go after and attack Roland Barthes, the French author who put forward the idea of the death of the author, that we should act like the author is dead, and I basically attack that point of view, and then sort of also critique Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, talk about all sorts of topics, in addition to kind of giving this like really honest, gritty look at what it's like to tour in an underground band in Europe. In addition to that, I've got the Nietzsche podcast. You can find that on YouTube or Spotify. You can just Google the Nietzsche podcast and it should come up. I'm sure you'll have links or whatever. I can send you all those links.
Beautiful.
And it's Untimely Reflections or Essential Salts, or all the other names associated with me and what I do. And that's pretty much it.
Where does the name Essential Salts come from?
So a long time ago, when I was setting up a Reddit account to promote my band, I was really into this death metal band called Nile that has a song called the Essential Salts.
Nice.
And so it's Nile is like an Egyptian death metal band, where not from Egypt, they write about ancient Egypt, like all the songs are about. And that was a particular song that was adapted from some like Lovecraftian like mythos about ancient Egypt, where they're like resurrecting the dead by it's kind of funny because it does have like, you could think about the metaphysical implications. They basically like reduce the soul down to the essential salts, and then they use it to like reconstitute the person of like, that's the essence of what they were. And they're like the necromancers of Giza. They're doing it to like resurrect people. And the song lyrics, he says they're like interrogating them about like, where's their gold buried, and like where are their treasures we can find and stuff, just like interrogating corpses so they can get treasure. So you know, it doesn't really have anything to do with philosophy or Nietzsche or anything. That was just the name that I picked a long time ago, and I still use it today.
I thought it was some hippie name for some type of like smelling salts or something like this, but that's much more
okay.
That's much more
yeah, no, it's much more metal.
Much more metal, 100%. Sounds like the land of alchemy, and someone distilling souls and resurrecting them. I like that. That's someone who's esoterically informed. It's one thing about metal is that it's very very esoterically informed. You find in a lot of metal bands some really well thought through stuff. So, Mr. Essential Salts, Mr. Keegan, thank you very much. Check out his book. Check out obviously his channel, the Nietzsche podcast. I'm pretty sure pretty much everybody who listens to this will be familiar with it, but he's on YouTube as well, on Spotify. And thank you very much for your time, sir. And let's call it a wrap there. Bye-bye, people. Have a good one.